How do you learn about the anatomy if you have never seen? How do you know about contraception if you've never seen it or you can't read instructions? Hello and welcome to the Blindseyepodcast, the podcast discussing everything you did and didn't want to know about being blind. My name is Connor. Hope everyone is well this week. This week's topic is a little bit different. I'm a bit nervous about doing it, but it's important, so that's why I wanted to do it, and I've been talking to some friends about it, and we all kind of think that there's a little bit of a gap in the market, no pun intended. So I want to talk about sex and disability, or having sexual relationships, sex education, sexual health, all these kinds of topics in relation to disability. Now, obviously, the disability I'm focusing on is blindness or low vision because that's the only one I know anything about. But I thought, it would be interesting to go into how do you learn about the anatomy if you have never seen? How do you know about contraception if you've never seen it or you can't read instructions, etc., etc., etc. All this kind of stuff, because there's quite a bit there and it's not particularly addressed. I know lots of this stuff isn't particularly addressed in the wider community anyway, which is a problem in and of itself, but there are some extra things going on as it refers to sex and being blind, for example. So, anyway, I thought that would be worth getting into. As always, this is just my thoughts and opinions and experiences. Just keep that in mind, especially today. I definitely am not talking for all people with disabilities here, as it's just related to blindness or low vision. And even then, I'm talking about myself or people I know or experiences that I've heard about or whatever it might be. Alright, so the first thing to get out of the way is there can be a notion among some people in the public that a person with a disability isn't sexually active or doesn't want to be, doesn't want to have a sex life or can't have a sex life that average people have. And that's just really not the case. But there is a prevailing wisdom out there about how could you do it? Or it's like a realm that's not possible for some people. At least that's the perception for a lot of people. So anyway, that's the first thing to get out of the way, because that ain't true. I know some very, very kinky disabled people. So keep that in mind. But it also comes down to, how do you learn about sex without vision and with lack of information? Because as we all know, unless we went to a school or had parents that were really on top of their game, usually what we find out from an early age is not much. Parents don't want to have the talk. Schools, especially religious schools, they don't want to go there at all. And so that situation is bad enough for people who can see, but it's a whole other ball game and magnified when it comes to somebody who's blind, because you can't even really pick up things. Like, for example, if you can see, you could read a book. You could see what an anatomy looks like. You could watch porn. Not that porn is a great representation, but if you don't even know what the opposite sex looks like, or what body parts they have, or where they are, or anything that's involved, how can you really have an informed or enjoyable sex life, or a safe sex life in any way, So unfortunately, that's the issue with the abstinence-only model. And again, that's just an issue in wider community. But you end up not knowing anything. And then because you don't know anything, again, happens for everybody, you ask your mates. And what do your mates know? Fuck all. Everyone's mates, especially when you're in your early teens, everyone thinks they know something, everyone's watched a movie. And a lot of times it's not true, it's not safe, it's not accurate, and it's embellished. And it's just because everyone wants to try and fit in. And unfortunately, because you're trying to fit in, we all know we get to that age where everybody around us seems to know what they're talking about, or they act like they know what they're talking about. And nobody wants to be the person who doesn't know, because that could be weird socially. So you don't particularly feel comfortable asking because you feel as though you're expected to know by a certain age. And then even the people who might know, you don't ask any questions of. As I said, it comes down to, it's a difficult topic. Even though we live in quite an open world now, it's hard enough to have those conversations if you're quote unquote able bodied. But if you're blind, for example, how do you say, look, how does it actually work? What does it look like? What do you actually have to do? It's a much more embarrassing conversation. It's an embarrassing conversation anyway, but you almost have to be more specific with your questions, because there's stuff that you just can't pick up via vision, whether it be on the internet or books or in real life. And the more precise you are about the details, the awkward the conversation. So all of that leads to a really troublesome situation for education reasons, health reasons, safety reasons, and just enjoyability reasons, really. As I said, also, lots of people can watch porn and they might find stuff out from porn. Now, the stuff they might find from porn could be widely inaccurate. There's a lot of issues with that in the present day, that it's unrealistic or it's unsafe or it's fake, whatever that might be. But if it's something as simple as the anatomy or whatever, there are things that you might be able to pick up, no matter how, I don't know, misunderstood or fake or misrepresented it is. But at least you can get some ideas of what's actually going on and what's actually involved in sexual relations. And as a side, I know plenty of people who are blind or plenty of people with disabilities who like porn, because there's a lot of different kind of porn out there. There's audio described porn, there's written porn, there's everything else in between. So again, that's not just the domain of sighted, able-bodied people. There's a lot of stuff in the world. There's a lot of people with a lot of crazy ideas and creative ways of doing things. So that also exists. Again, this notion that people with disability are soft little vulnerable angels who don't really know how the world works just isn't true. Alright, so that brings me on to contraception. So with contraception, again, I think we all have these issues, whether you can see or whether you can't. But again, there's some extra levels involved. So if you can see, you might be embarrassed to walk into a chemist. Nobody wants to do that and go, hey, I want to buy whatever you need to buy, whatever your contraception choice or need is. But if you're someone who's blind, you can't do that. You might be able to get yourself to the chemist, but if you could see, you could go to the right counter, you could go to the right aisle, pick up whatever, try to not make eye contact with whoever it is you're exchanging the money with, and just get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. But for somebody like myself, if I wanted to do that, I would have to go to the front desk of the chemist and go, excuse me, I would like to buy such and such and such. Oh, what size? Never you mind. But it's a whole different confronting scenario. And thank God online shopping has kind of come along, because it just takes that out of the question. But these are the kinds of things that happen when you don't have the luxury or the anonymity of just rushing in there and doing it on your own, because somebody else has to be involved in those kinds of scenarios. There's also the issue too that there's lots of different contraceptive methods out there. And again, if you can't see them or read the instructions or whatever it might be, you can be left in the dark. So it relies on you having good relationships with people around you and just trying to overcome the embarrassment to work out what's best for you or what's happening, or to get well-informed, educated opinions or recommendations, whatever that might be. But not everybody is comfortable with that, or not everybody has that. Not everybody's surrounded by family or friends that are comfortable with those kinds of situations. I know for myself, I was 12 when my vision went, so I was just kind of at that age where, you're starting to think about girls in a different way. They're not full of cooties or whatever anymore. But I didn't really know anything, and my family are fairly conservative, come from an Irish Catholic background. Things aren't really spoken about. And I didn't really know anything. So it wasn't until I was well into my late high school years that I even knew what a condom was. I think for a couple of years I wasn't even calling it the right. I was calling it a comdon. I was putting the N and the M in the wrong places. And again, you're with your mates, and your mates talking like they know everything, so you don't want to be the jackass who gets it wrong. So you're just nodding along and internally going, I don't know what the hell you guys are talking about. But they could see what was going on. So I couldn't even understand the concept until I was well into my late teens. And again, you can't read instructions. So if you're coming up against contraception that has particular kinds of instructions, which most of them all have, in order to use it safely, then if you can't read it, what do? You either ask somebody, or you have a loving partner or whoever it might be that can help you, or you wing it. And as we all know, winging it can be great. Winging it can lead to all sorts of unpleasantries. I mentioned as well about the anatomy. Now, I am aware that in some places or in some small groups, they try and organize access to 3D models, which some people might think is funny. But again, if you have never been intimate with somebody before, and you might have been blind your whole life, or you might have been blind before you were even sort of thinking or talking about sex like I was, then it's very hard for you to know what the mechanics are, really. For enjoyment reasons, but also just in terms of your own health, making sure that you're well, making sure you don't have any illnesses or diseases, whether they're transmittable ones or whether they're just ones that affect different parts of the body. But if you never have those conversations and you don't have access to that information, then there's an issue. It's also as well just not about the functionality. As we're younger, if we do learn anything, it's about the full functional mechanics. This is how a man and woman have a child. That's basically what you get told. Don't tell the kids that it might be enjoyable, or don't tell kids that it might make you feel better, it might improve your mental health, or the connections you have with people, or your emotional well-being. So even just getting the functional side of it, while that's good, that's not the whole story, because plenty of people lead really happy, healthy sex lives, and it's more than just, well, we want to have kids. So again, if that's missing, then that's a big problem. I mentioned, STDs and things like that. And from a really basic level, it's that thing where you go, well, if I've never learned what any of this stuff is, how will I even know if I have something? God forbid if that happens. Will I know? Is it something that's visual? Is it something I'll feel? If nobody ever has a conversation with you, for all you know, there's something very obvious that you would be able to tell either on yourself or a partner or whoever visually. But if you can't see it, then that's just begging for something to go wrong. And nobody has that conversation. So how do you ever learn, okay, if this happens, this is what I need to do, or these are a warning sign of such and such. But that doesn't really exist unless you have the right people around you. There's no standardization. There's no access to that in many places. So again, it's just begging for catastrophe. All right, I'm going to wrap this up in a second. No pun intended. No, definitely pun intended. But it also comes down to as well, like some people would say, well, do blindness organizations, could they not do this? But a lot of blindness organizations don't want to touch this stuff because a lot of them are genuinely conservative in nature. There's a lot of older clients because it's more often than not that vision impacts you worse when you are elderly. Elderly people are more likely to be conservative. So they have to walk this tightrope of not wanting to piss off donors and certain client groups, but then it also means that they won't address this for a smaller client group. And while I understand it, I don't agree with it because in my book, this kind of stuff is way more important than keeping donors on side or elderly clients who might think a certain way. But I do get asked that question, well, can't they just do that? And no, generally they don't. I did find out from a friend that apparently in San Francisco, one of the organizations there actually had a sexual therapist for people to speak to and find out information. But also, like, that's San Francisco. San Francisco, anything goes. It's very liberal. Things are open. Things aren't very taboo. So I could completely understand why that exists in San Francisco. But again, why should I have to take being in San Francisco to have just a basic education in health and an integral part of being a human being? I also wonder, and I don't know if this is true or not, and I'd love to hear back from any blind or vision impaired people listen to this who are in this group, but I often wonder, is this situation even worse if you're blind in the LGBTQI community? Because most people won't even touch it when it comes to straight, traditional, normalized, whatever you want to call it, relationships. But if you're somebody who's blind with a disability or whatever, and you fall into one of those categories, then I could imagine that's probably even more taboo. Yes, there's been a lot of progress made in the last couple of decades in terms of acceptance of those communities, but that's very different to, hey, can you tell me how this operates, when it's not a traditional man-woman setup? Again, I don't know if it is worse, but I can't help but think that it probably is, especially when, if you do get an education, it's completely based on functionality and procreation, not anything else. Whereas in those kinds of relationships, it's obviously not going to be about creating life in many cases, because that's impossible. So I just wonder if that's a bigger issue. I also forgot to mention with a lot of this that it's not even necessarily about what you know or what education you have. I mean, if you're in a situation where you're about to go to bed with somebody and you can't see, for all you know, they're telling you they're using contraception, and you might not be able to see or feel to know that they are or they aren't. So you're taking someone's word for it. Whereas, somebody who can see, I know it still happens even in the sighted world where, some dickhead tries to pull a shifty. But again, for somebody who can't see, particularly women who can't see, I can't help but think, well, that would definitely be an issue because you just don't have the same amount of information coming from your senses. So the last two things I'll talk about are adult services and pregnancy. So when it comes to adult services, in the disabled community, it's quite common to use adult services. I mean, it's quite common to use those things just in general, disabled or not. But that exists. One, because there's that idea that maybe people aren't sexually active or interested, and there's that closed-mindedness to it. So a lot of people with disabilities can't get it, or they're not in situations where somebody is attracted to them in the first place because of the disability or whatever it might be. So a lot of people go to adult services because, again, they're in a situation where the health is much more apparent. There's more things going on. There's much more trust involved. And I guess it's just kind of a happy medium for people in a situation that might not be exactly what they want. But what's the alternative? And the last thing is pregnancy. Now, I really recommend going on YouTube and checking out a YouTuber called Holly Scott Gardner. Now, she's blind as well. She's quite well known in UK, and she does this really interesting YouTube video of she explains how she, as a blind woman, would take a pregnancy test. Because obviously you have the issues of getting your hands on a test. How can you read what the test says after you've done what you needed to do? How do you keep it secret from other people? Because generally that's not a thing that you want to involve everybody in. And there's a really good video of her doing it. So I'll give you a quick little rundown. But basically, she found a company that sells digital pregnancy sticks, tests, whatever you call them. I'm a guy, so I don't really know. But she found this company who sells digital ones. So she pees on it or whatever, and then the digital screen a few minutes later will read on it, pregnant or not pregnant. Now, obviously, she can't see that screen, but in the video, it shows she has a couple of different methods. So one method is we all who are blind or low vision generally have these kind of apps that can read text with our phone cameras. So she tries to place the camera of her phone over the digital screen, and then that will read out to her whether it says pregnant, not pregnant. The other option is to use apps like Be My Eyes, where there's volunteers involved, or Ira, where there's professionals involved who can tell you what you're seeing through your phone camera, and they can read it to you. But again, that's involving another person in the process. She actually does talk about how, I think it's Be My Eyes, has a partnership with this company who produces this particular pregnancy test. So it's going to somebody with a bit more knowledge, and there's a privacy thing in place to make sure. But again, all of these things, I never even thought about that until I watched the video. I'm a guy. I don't have to think about how would I know if I'm pregnant. I can't get pregnant. So for me, I read the title and thought, oh yeah, how the hell would you know? How do you do it? Like, what do you have to pee on something and go, hey mum, what does this say? Well, like, so it's well worth checking it out. I'll post up the link to it and all the social media channels. But yeah, look, I hope that was interesting. It's an interesting topic. It's important to myself and a few close friends of mine who are also blind, because it's an issue. So if you like what I do, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, even a share to your friends, or telling anybody about the show if you like it. Helps. Every little bit helps. So as always, you can get in touch with the show by emailing blindseyepodcast@gmail.com. That's BLINDSEYE podcast@gmail.com. You can search for me on Instagram and Facebook if you search for Blindseye Podcast, and I'm on Twitter @Blindseyepod. And I will be back to speak to you next week. Cheers.